an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Parable of the Sower. Revamped, renewed, rereading. In this episode, I am restarting the book from page 1, and here we go. It is a little bit more disturbing to read it this time around than it was before. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Danique for commissioning this book. Those of you who have asked if they could, start commissioning me for new properties may be wondering why I was willing to start this over again. And this is one of those things that it was sort of like a judgment call at the time. Keen-eyed listeners will remember that I have done 2 episodes covering Parable of the Sower already. It has been almost a full year since those episodes were commissioned. Those were in April of 2019. And Danique came at me and was like, listen, I got a bonus. I want to buy the whole book outright and just make sure that you're able to cover it, because she only was able to commission 2 episodes before it all sort of trailed off. And she was like, I really want you to finish this book, and I'm willing to pay for you to restart from the beginning and cover the first 2 sections over again. And I am interested in finishing this as well. It's been one of those books that has kind of come up in my head a few times that I've thought about and wondered where it was heading. And I'm kind of glad, I considered just reading it on my own once it trailed off, because that's sort of, the policy is that once something hasn't been commissioned for ages, that's it. Well, I'm glad I didn't, because when she came at me, she was like, can I just PayPal you what it would cost to cover the whole book, and you create the episodes, the slots, wherever you can fit them. And I decided to go with it. There's obviously, pardon me, I'm going to be sipping tea here and there, guys, because I have a sore throat today. It's not just about wanting to finish the book. It's also, I'm getting married and I need the money, and this is helpful. So I decided that I would make an exception to the rule, mostly because of getting to restart it. It's not something I've done before, and I'm curious to see how it'll go. It might be odd enough that I decide I don't want to handle it this way again with something else. For example, Rome, people completely fell off commissioning that. I have not continued to watch Rome. I intended to binge it, and then I didn't. So I'm kind of wondering, if anybody came at me and wanted me to restart Rome, would I be willing to do that? Would I be interested in doing that? So, this is sort of a test subject for changing the way that I think about handling some of these things. But anyway, enough of that. So, I really am startled at beginning this book again. Guys, the landscape in our country has shifted so dramatically, and I feel like it's astonishing to me. I've talked to a few people who they don't seem to see it. And of course, this all depends. What you see all depends on where you are coming from as a person in your life, your levels of privilege and where you get your information is always going to make a difference in what you hear and are aware of, and, just in general, the way you interpret things that are happening that you see in the news. And for me, what has happened over this past 3 years has been incredibly dramatic to begin with. But I feel like I personally have gone through the biggest shift in attitude over this last year. And I don't think I realized how dramatic it was until I started rereading this from the beginning and noticed how differently I am interpreting this time around. And what I mean by that is there is a way, whether you notice it or not, that we all consume media about specifically apocalypses, and that feels like such a dramatic word. That also, to me, feels like a sort of a supernatural word. But we're looking at a United States in this book that has essentially fallen apart, and everything is sort of like, it's all sort of masquerading as still being like part of the same whole as it was. We are all sort of collectively pretending in this book that things haven't gone completely down the shithole. And by collectively pretending, I don't mean the individual people. I mean the government is sort of like functioning according to traditions and customs rather than the actual law. And because of that, it gives the illusion of there still being like a regulatory body and functioning arms of government, when in fact they are not doing the job they are put there for. And what I have experienced, and I'm going to get really emotional talking about this, so I hope that you guys are all ready for some realness this morning from me. What I have realized over this past year is how much our government depends on custom. How much our government depends on what we have always trusted to be acceptable without having to put it into writing and contract. How much we have relied on the basic decency of human beings and the respect for offices and the respect for the spirit of the law. And don't get me wrong, I know that our country has a deeply fucked up history. Problematic was the word I was going to use, and that's not adequate. And I know that we have always been a country that oppresses and builds itself on the backs of people whom it is oppressing. That is who we are. That is how our country was founded, whether we like to believe it or not, whether we want to leave it in the past or not. That is the foundation of everything. So you may want to pretend that that foundation isn't there. It doesn't change the fact that there are corpses underneath the house. Okay? So I want to address that. I know that this is true. However, even so, there has been a level of decorum associated with that, where it was sort of acting as a bit of a shield to the public, fooling us into believing that what we as a people, the public, wanted mattered. What we voted for mattered. And I have started to reach a point where I almost want to say it's a good thing in some ways, even though I can't really say that and believe it. We've started to reach a point where the bald-faced lies, the throwing aside of custom and respect, the shamelessness overall of the way we function as a country is so overt and it's so impossible to ignore that I am constantly wondering what it's going to take to get us to mobilize. And this is such a difficult question because this book is excellent at showing us exactly how people continue to live under a regime that is damaging, that is violent, that is predatory, without actually organizing themselves to fight back. And the answer is how they manage to do this and keep us this way is they force us to fight for every little scrap of a living that we can make. So we have these communities in this book desperate to simply get by without being noticed. They want to do well enough that they are safe and protected, but not so well that they draw attention to themselves. And they want, by being safe and protected, I mean able to feed themselves, able to do basic medical treatments for people. Actual healthcare is out of the question. Going to the police for a huge group of this community is out of the question. The police in this book are, they run on a fee. You have to pay them for their assistance. And the thing is that, I feel like there was so much about this that felt like it was possible when I first read this, but it didn't feel super close to home. And then just yesterday, there was an article in my county in Texas about how they are considering making the fire department a paid service, that they are thinking that they are going to start charging fees. And there was an assertion in the comments that oh, don't worry about it. They don't mean individuals. They mean that your home insurance will be forced to pay for it. To which I'm yeah, that's still us paying for it though. The home insurance, if they are forced to cover more than simply the destruction of the home, but also other fees, your fees will go up and you will be the one shouldering the burden for that. And honestly, I'm not even super confident that it's just the insurance that's going to do it, because we are told things all the time are going to work a certain way in order to reassure us. And then when it comes down to it, we find out that we are not actually functioning that way. There is a lot in this book this time around that just feels so much more immediately possible than it did only a year ago. And the unsteadiness of my own viewpoint of our country really shakes me up a little bit. I never thought I would be somebody who in many ways believed maybe voting doesn't matter. And that is not to say that I want to not vote, because I still have enough of a spark of hope left that I will continue to do my duty, because I believe that is the right thing to do. And I believe that there is a possibility it still makes a difference. But if I found out that it didn't, I wouldn't be surprised by it. And there is so much that they can do to prevent people from being able to access such a basic right as the right to vote, that all you have to do, you disenfranchise anybody who has been arrested for a crime and been in prison. You make it so that people have to have an actual street address rather than a P.O. box, so that all Native Americans who depend on P.O. boxes are unable to register at all. You make it so that, for me, for example, I tried to register to vote in 2 different states under the category of Hispanic. And both times, for reasons unknown, my application bounced back to me and was not approved. I came to Texas and applied to vote as white, and it was approved immediately. No problem. I don't think that's a coincidence. I do not think those things are accidental or an oversight. I think they are systemic and purposeful. And as we get into this book and the politics that have begun to really take hold, we have this President Jarrett, I believe his name is, who bears such a resemblance to Trump in so much of his policy. And he was in the background with an election coming during the last book. But in this book, once we begin, we have jumped ahead quite a few years. I think it might be like 20 years, maybe a little bit more. He is established. And it is uncanny. You know, it is just uncanny. And I know that is definitely something that I did touch on with the last, coverage. But once you start to see the shifting of things over this past year, heading into a new election cycle, it feels different than it did. Early 2016, Trump was upsetting. Trump was a guy who most people saw as a joke, never going to win, not going to be an actual threat, but deeply upsetting and frustrating because he was getting a lot of airtime and attention. And now we are heading into an election cycle in which he is a real threat. He has already been in power 4 years. We just saw an impeachment that is a joke that is so obvious, it proves so much that they can just do whatever they want, you guys. They just decided no witnesses and threw it out. They just decided that. Despite the majority of Americans feeling that evidence was necessary, witnesses were necessary, despite the spirit of the law and how that should work, despite the standards they held for presidents past, because this is their guy, it's a completely different situation. And I don't feel I have ever seen a more blatant example in my life of how shamelessly self-interested these people are and how willing they are to let everyone else burn for the sake of their own advancement. And it really shakes me up. I feel like this impeachment, more than anything, is what made me realize that we believe there are checks and balances in place. And the truth is the checks and balances are controlled by the people who stand to gain something if they are not there. So why would those people enforce them? And that's a really sobering realization to have. So with that, let's get into this. Prologue. Here we are. Energy, mass, life shaping life, mind shaping mind, God shaping God. Consider we are born not with purpose, but with potential. And then we get this excerpt from her daughter. They'll make a god of her. I think that would please her, if she could know about it. In spite of all her protests and denials, she always needed devoted, obedient followers, disciples who would listen to her and believe everything she told them. And she needed large events to manipulate. All gods seem to need these things. She was my biological mother. She is dead. I have wanted to love her and to believe that what happened between her and me wasn't her fault. I've wanted that, but instead I've hated her, feared her, needed her. I've never trusted her, though. Never understood how she could be the way she was. So focused and yet so misguided. There for all the world, but never there for me. I still don't understand. And now that she's dead, I'm not even sure I ever will. But I must try because I need to understand myself, and she is part of me. I wish that she weren't, but she is. In order for me to understand who I am, I must begin to understand who she was. That is my reason for writing and assembling this book. So, first of all, I don't feel like I really appreciated last time what a bold move it is for this author to write a book from the perspective of a character and then begin the following book from the perspective of somebody who despises that character. Especially despises because they are related, directly related. That's a really interesting choice. And I am fascinated to see what comes of this, because it's easy to read this and remember the Lauren that we knew from the first book and feel that her daughter is misjudging her and misunderstanding her. And the truth is that by the time we get into this book, we don't know Lauren anymore. Obviously, so much has changed in the world, in the way that she functioned, in the community that she had built, that she is guaranteed to not be the same person. The Lauren that we knew was 17 years old. And now we have this daughter who I believe is around that age, maybe a little bit older. So more time has passed since the last book's POV than she had even been alive by the time that book started. We don't necessarily know Lauren anymore. We know who she was when she was young and what her ideals were. That does not mean much. For who I am right now versus who I was as a teenager, in many ways, some of my ideals are still the same. But my understanding of the world at large is very different. And I am extremely curious to find out if I am going to agree with her daughter or if I'm going to be like, oh, sweetie, no, you just are misunderstanding everything. And again, this is her daughter. There may be a perfectly good reason for her misunderstanding. There may be bad communication. There may be her only seeing part of a story and we know the truth behind a thing that she doesn't know. Or there could be things that are hidden from both us and her. As readers, we're seeing things through her eyes, and if she doesn't know a thing, and if it isn't something that happened in the last book, there's no reason to think that we will necessarily know what it is. So I am really interested in this take and seeing where this goes. So she talks also about, and by she, I mean the main character, and I am forgetting her name. I don't remember if we actually, let me see if her legal name was Lauren Oya Olamina Benkole. She's dead. She's my mother. I don't think I saw her actual name here. But I think it comes up a little bit later. So she mentions that she has copies of everything that was saved of her mother's writings. And I think that's really key to getting a grip on where this is going, because she says, not, I have all of her writings. She says, I have copies of all that was saved of her writings, which means to me that her writings are now considered so important that her own daughter is not being trusted with the originals, which is really interesting. So this is, all right. So chapter 1, we begin with a entry from Benkole, and you don't this. It wasn't really hitting me when I first read it that this was him beginning a habit of writing that is not something he was necessarily interested in, that Lauren maybe pushed him to do this. But it turns out to mean a lot to his daughter, because she feels much more of a kinship and closeness to her father than she ever did her mom. And there's this kind of breaking down of what happened, because Lauren, like I said, when we start the last book, is only 17, and she hasn't been aware enough or adult for long enough to know exactly what led to what world she was now living in. So Bankole is providing really valuable adult insight into the events leading up to the apocalypse, or more commonly, more bitterly known as the pox. I've read that the period of upheaval lasted from 2015 through 2030, a decade and a half of chaos. This is untrue. The pox has been a much longer torment. It began well before 2015, perhaps even before the turn of the millennium. It has not ended. I have also read that the pox was caused by accidentally coinciding climactic, economic, and sociological crises. It would be more honest to say that the pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with obvious problems in those areas. We caused the problems, then we sat and watched as they grew into crises. I have heard people deny this, but I was born in 1970. I have seen enough to know that it is true. I have watched education become more a privilege of the rich than the basic necessity that it must be if civilized society is to survive. I have watched as convenience, profit, inertia excused greater and more dangerous environmental degradation. I have watched poverty, hunger, and disease become inevitable for more and more people. Y'all, this is the shit I'm talking about. That as time wears on and I educate myself more in the way that our country works, the more frightened I am at how people fall through the cracks. And it's not adequate to say fall through the cracks, because falling through the cracks implies we are trying to help people, but we just can't manage to get them all. And that's not what's happening. We do not care about helping people because there will always be more poor people. We just need poor people to be our labor and uphold the basis of profit for upper classes. And so many poor can die and be rendered useless, in quotes, before it ever begins to impact the rich, that they do not care. And, education becoming more of a privilege of the rich. I mean, we have so-called free public education right now for children. And it is absurdly, all schools are funded by the taxes from their areas, which means that in lower income, depressed areas, they have practically no budget for education. And in richer, more well-off areas, they have so much money that they can build things like professional level football stadiums. And, like my school, for example, in Wallingford, had a planetarium. Like, what? Why? I mean, it was awesome. But, like, there are schools out there that can't give all their kids books. And we had a planetarium, which is not a necessity. And the idea that education is free and therefore equally accessible to everyone, while not acknowledging that it is free in quotes for many people and not actually free. For me, going to school in a white suburb, it was free. Books were provided. I had to pay for my supplies, but the teachers were compensated decently. Not well, but decently. And they were not afraid to come to work. That is not the case in a lot of schools. There are schools out there that can't even heat the buildings that their kids are in. They can't fucking afford to heat the place or to cool it. I mean, there are so many schools in which there are 30 kids to a classroom, and the teacher who had used to have an assistant to help her manage now has to work completely on her own. And I say her because in this case, I'm talking specifically about my stepmother who was in that situation. And she loved children and loved her job. And she started coming home from work and crying because she was so overwhelmed and was reprimanded so frequently for the behavior of students that she did not have the ability to manage because she was one person. And when you have a classroom full of kids for whom there is not an authority figure, like keeping watch on them, they are not going to be getting the same kind of focused education as other children. So there are so many factors that go into a so-called free education, and behaving as if that's not true is just denial. It's just not wanting to see the truth. And then we have a whole other system with charter schools and private schools. And so to insinuate that like everybody who is getting a free education is going to be on the same footing as everyone else is ludicrous. I had the privilege of going to a private school for my senior year of high school because I went for a major that was in dire need of more students, and I got basically a full ride. And I watched these kids be able to get all kinds of private tutoring. We applied to colleges, and we were required by our school to apply to a minimum of 12, which those of you who have applied to colleges know how overwhelming that is already. But then there's also the fees to apply. And every college had a minimum fee of $50 simply to apply. Some had more, depending on the kind of major you were applying for. And I was like one of the only poor kids, me and like two other people out of a school of, 300 kids. And I had to apply for aid in order to simply apply to these colleges and wait to hear back and make sure. So I already started off behind, waiting to complete the assignment. And once I applied, I got in everywhere. Now, it's been really easy for me to feel like I was an exceptional student. And that's why I got in everywhere. And that may be part of it. I was a good student. But I don't think I ever really wanted to look at the fact that the school I came from did a lot of the work for me. They saw that I was coming from a private school with a bunch of other affluent people. They didn't know that I wasn't necessarily, or maybe they did if they knew I applied for aid. And they had a preconceived notion of the kind of student that gets churned out of a school like that. And I am positive that was part of what caused them to set my resume aside and my application aside. So right there, out of the gate, education is a completely different animal from childhood. And as things have been continuing and our funding for schools have deteriorated, and now, on top of all of the usual problems that teachers have to worry about, now we have school shootings that are causing kids trauma. They have to they go through this thing, and it happens so frequently now that we are basically numb to it. They go through this thing, see their friends die, and then have to return to the building in which it happened and continue on with their education as if it didn't, as if they didn't watch friends die here days ago. And we are selling backpacks with bulletproof panels in them so that kids have something to hold in front of themselves in case of an attack. And we have security guards armed, patrolling high school campuses. And we are encouraging drills to teach kids and their teachers ways in which to protect children, that this is not their job. We are expecting teachers to throw themselves in front of gunfire for $30,000 a year. And as much as we might like to say that should just be accepted because they are the adults, and when you are an adult in charge of children, your life should be what is between someone trying to harm your children and the attacker. But let's be real here. That is an unfair thing. That is a deeply fucked up thing to expect of somebody who is just trying to teach kids math. So this right here made me stop and just be like, good God, this is already just feeling much more real to me. There were several small bloody shooting wars going on around the world during the pox. Amid all of this, the United States of America suffered a major non-military defeat. It lost no important war, yet it did not survive the pox. Perhaps it simply lost sight of what it once intended to be, then blundered aimlessly until it exhausted itself. What is left of it now, what it has become, I do not know. Now, I would like to say that as much as I get really angry about this sort of, this can be something glib people just say and think that they're being really smart. The more I think about it, the more I believe that a succession is probably the best thing for the United States. There is clearly an enormous segment of the population that wants to live in a theocracy, that wants to have laws with, capital punishment being obvious, but these are people who want a return to really ugly norms. And the thing about a secession is that there are going to be people who do not want to be part of that country, unable to leave it and come to the side of the country in which the laws that they do believe in are being upheld. But frankly, I don't see us being able to come out of the divisiveness that we have been experiencing these past few years as a United States anymore. I just don't really think it's possible any longer. And I kind of wonder if that isn't all to the good. Then we get this girl and she's talking about her father and how she loved her father and that he seems to have been a thoughtful man. She reflects on her mother being so much younger than him, and how he sort of came into this relationship wanting to protect Lauren, not understanding exactly how little that protection was going to actually be necessary. So then we jump to an entry from 2013. And Lauren is describing the recurring nightmare that she has. And it's something that is really moving when you've read the first one and you remember this life. She is in the community that she had been that was surrounded by that wall. And her father is preaching. And she walks through and everybody is sort of ghostly. And he is, there is this sort of sense that they maybe can't see her. And she sees her mother and tries to reach out to her mother and cannot reach her. And she tries to move to get closer and she can't move. And she just stares as in an attempt to sort of get her mother's attention, but it doesn't actually work. And we get a reminder of Paracetamol, which is the drug that her mother was taking. It was something that had been formulated to assist people who had Alzheimer's. And the problem was that it aided with intellectual function in people who had Alzheimer's and brought them kind of back to a base level. But when you were already at base level, it made you that much more focused, able to put thoughts together. And she generally talks about students and sort of treated as Adderall. And her mother was taking the drug. And apparently her hyperempathy is a result of that. the hyperempathy is something that a lot of people experience. And she, in the first book is one of the only ones for the majority of it that experiences this. And then eventually, they, team up with some other people that have hyperempaths in their group as well. It's something that people try and hide because it can be weaponized in a way. And, they want to not show weakness and vulnerability. So they don't let a lot of people know that they can even experience this. So her father is preaching, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. When my father has said these words, my mother vanishes. I haven't even been able to see her whole face, and now she's gone. I don't understand this. It scares me. I can see now that other people are vanishing too. Most have already gone. Beloved ghosts. My father is gone. My stepmother calls out to him in Spanish the way she did sometimes when she was excited. No! How can we live now? They'll break in, they'll kill us all. We must build the wall higher. And she's gone. My brothers are gone. I'm alone, as I was alone that night 5 years ago. The house is ashes and rubble around me. So she wakes up and she's completely flipped out. And Bankole isn't in the bed with her. And she notices that when he isn't in bed, she tends to have these nightmares. When he's around, they don't happen. So she isn't really able to tell if she screams in her sleep or not because he's never around for them. And she's recalling that maybe this dream was brought on by the fact that they went to, they had an attack on a group in an area called Dovetree. There had been 22 people, and all that was left is, I think, 2 women and 2 kids, or maybe 2 women and 3 kids. The 2 youngest wives and 3 little children. And the thing about this attack is that this is not a bunch of raiders who just came in and took what they could take and raped and then bailed with some captives. These were people who came in and killed systemically in this way that was systematically. They were here to eliminate everybody that they could. And that they all were wearing a sort of a uniform, like tunics, that were black with a white cross on the front. They snuck in so quiet. We never saw them until they started shooting at us. 20 or 30 or more guns going off at just the same time. And they didn't steal or burn anything until they had beaten us, shot us. Then they took our fuel and went straight to our fields and burned our crops. After that, they raided the houses and barns. They even shot the kids. Everybody they found, they killed them. I hid with my baby, or they would have shot him and me. And Lauren notes that especially the killing of children is unusual. Children are easy targets for human trafficking. And that is something that is almost always the goal of attacking families like this, is to steal the kids to sell. And the fact that they didn't do that means that these are not ordinary raiders. They are after something else here. I didn't think of what it might be until after I had let Aubrey go back to the clinic to bed. And then she starts thinking about Jarrett. Jarrett insists on being a throwback to some earlier, simpler time. Now does not suit him. Religious tolerance does not suit him. The current state of the country does not suit him. He wants to take us all back to some magical time when everyone believed in the same God, worshipped him in the same way, and understood their safety in the universe depended on completing the same religious rituals and stomping anyone who was different. There was never such a time in this country. But these days, when more than half the people in the country can't read at all, history is just one more vast unknown to them. And she talks about the uptick in burning witches, which is just insanity and just happens to be anybody who is not Christian. Even Catholics at times, because that makes sense to me. My father was like this fundamentalist, and Catholics were as good as not Christian in their eyes many times. Jarrett's people have been known to beat or drive out Unitarians, for goodness sake. Jarrett condemns the burnings, but does so in such mild language that his people are free to hear what they want to hear. Yep. Yep. Help us make America great again. Guys, I just can't with the fact that she nailed that fucking slogan. It's not like that slogan is so unique that it would really be like, it's completely out of the question, but it is just chilling. And his opponent calls him a demagogue, a rabble-rouser, a hypocrite. And he's right, but he's so tired, and he's so gray. And Jarrett is handsome, and yada, yada, yada. What's so funny here is that Trump is, like, Jarrett is clearly somebody with, like, real charisma who is intelligent, and he's, like, a terrible human being, but he seems to have a strategy. Trump is just such a fucking idiot from beginning to end. The fact that he has sort of stumbled into this community of people who uphold him as the symbol for what they believe, even though he clearly does not believe any of it, makes it even more frightening to me, because what that means is that there is a crowd behind him that believes him, and whether or not the leader appears, they will make one, and that will be enough. So she talks about the way that communities are targeted nowadays, and how people are kind of like, they are mistrustful of anybody who's not from their community, and that rumors might start about a person in your community, and whether they are true or not, they are dangerous, because, you know, if people in surrounding areas begin to see you as a threat and they decide to team up or even not team up, there might be enough within one community to take you on. They can fuck you up. And there had been some, like, problems with getting people to trust Benkole as a doctor. He's a guy, you know, women and children are being preyed upon these days in ways that they had never been before. It is understandable that they would be loath to trust this guy. Anybody who might have come to the Crowdcast, something just happened. It's been going wrong since I started this, and it's like just managed to hang on until now, when it suddenly seemed to shut down as if I clicked to end the broadcast. So apologies if you're watching it and something just stopped, but I'm going to continue recording and this episode will be complete. So Benkole eventually earns the trust of some people after he manages to, basically, he not only manages to save a couple of people, but he reprimands one family for waiting so long to bring their daughter to him. I think her appendix burst or something. And they all sort of like sit on it, and they're not really sure what, like, if they even need to go to him. I don't know what they thought was going to happen, but he is disgusted by it. So that winds up sort of winning him over some friends, and they are becoming a little bit more settled in this area than they had been. And so there are 59 people, 64 with the dove tree if they stay. With numbers like that, we barely do exist. All the more reason for my dream. And obviously this is about her starting this Earthseed cult, which is, you know, the fact that they might be called a cult is particularly dangerous in these times. And they might be a target. Dovetree is like not that far north of them. And the fact that they got hit by this organized group is definitely worrisome. So chapter 2, we have the, you know, the description of Earthseed, Harry Balter, and Zara Moss, who I remember, Travis, Natividad, Dominic Douglas, all of the people that are familiar to us. And then we get a description of the folks who are brought in after they have settled in this particular area. The land it settled on belonged to my father. There was on that land when the group arrived one dependable well, a half-ruined garden, a number of fruit and nut trees, and groves of oaks, pines, and redwoods. So they began to have children. They scavenged. They traded knowledge about how to repair. Like, there's a lot of requirements in the community about learning how to read and write, which many people do not know how to do, and passing on knowledge of different trades. So carpentry. I'm not sure how useful electrical is. It doesn't seem like the electrical grid is working out here, but I don't actually know. But, gardening, and Bencoli needs to teach somebody to be able to do medicine because he's old and he's going to be passing on. So eventually we get to the description of this moment out with Lauren and another crew. And she is with Ramiro and Mike, I think, and there's one other person. And they are heading out to scavenge. And she says that, it's sort of like strange to her that despite the fact that a community had just been targeted nearby, they aren't as cautious as they might otherwise be, because they are going to an area that is familiar to them, that they've been a million times. So they're kind of, not really paying the attention that they should. And all of a sudden, they get rained down on by gunfire. And what it turns out it is that there is a couple of kids left alive, plus there are some adults who are technically alive, but they are so injured that they are unconscious. And these kids are trying to keep away a repeat attack. And there are 3 adults, I think. 2 are still alive and 1 is dead. And then there are these 2 very, very young children. And there's this whole kind of conversation between Lauren and I think Mike specifically. And she notes how suspicious Mike is, and that he is just somebody who it took a long time for him to accept his integration into their community. They accepted him in, and his wife, and I think he has 2 daughters. And she says that it took 6 months before he finally accepted that they weren't suddenly going to trade his wife and daughters into slavery or something. And, to a degree, being suspicious is really helpful and smart. But there does come a time where it interferes with being a decent person. Now, this is one of those things that I have really strong feelings on, because there is such a sort of fear, I think, out there of being seen as a mark, as a dupe. I get so mad about this, guys. That we let that overshadow doing something kind. A few months ago, I was in a parking lot and this woman came up to me in tears. And she was like, I am so sorry, but I do not have the money for gas to get to work. I just had to buy insulin. And I went to the grocery store to get some groceries because we were in the parking lot of a store. And I bought the bare minimum of what I needed, and it took all my money. And I could totally understand if people hear this and think that it's not true. And that I was being a soft touch. But I have been here before. I have literally run out of gas on the side of the road because I was too broke to fill my own tank. And there is nothing like that feeling of helplessness and having nobody to turn to. And the desperation in the way this woman spoke to me just felt true. It just did. And I told her to wait, and I went to an ATM and I got out $60 and I gave it to her, and she just started sobbing and like grabbed onto my hands and was just like, bless you. And I felt so bad because you could see that when I left and told her I was going to come back, she didn't really believe me. And it's understandable. And there are going to be people out there who are going to say that she made that up and I'm ridiculous. I just lost $60. And the thing is, when it comes down to it, how you decide to handle yourself in that situation is not about them anymore. Do you want to be the kind of person who turns their back on somebody who may really need your help on the chance that they are not telling the truth? Or do you want to be somebody who helps and then lets it go and allows that person to do what they want with the money, and they will accept the consequences of their own actions? I personally want to be a helper. If I can, I will. And I am very lucky in the past few months to be in the position where I can give away $60 and I will be okay. I have never, for the record, been in this position in my entire life. So I am appreciating the fuck out of it. And when somebody comes to me and needs help, I'm not going to hold back on that. So this guy, Mike, while I get where he's coming from, and he doesn't want to risk, this isn't risking $60, right? This is him risking his life. So it's obviously very different stakes, but there is just a fundamental disparity in the way that he comes at life and the way that Lauren comes at life. And she winds up risking it, even though there has been, gunfire. And Bankole later, when she brings these people back, and Bankole is not thrilled because they need a lot of medical attention, Bankole is really mad at her for choosing to take this risk. And I mean, it's understandable that he feels that way, but also I really get where Lauren's coming from. She heard a child sobbing, and he's kind of like, you have seen kids in positions like this before where, it's, he says something like, I'm trying to find the spot where he like gets at her. You're old enough to know better. Oh, she says something about the child crying, and he says, you've seen children led down the road in convict collars or chains. You've seen them displayed as enticements before houses of prostitution. Are you going to tell me you did this because you heard one crying? I do what I can, I said. When I can do more, I will. You know that. And I wanted the house truck. And, she points out too that if they had just left empty-handed, there was a chance that they were still going to get shot at and still be hurt. So she kind of felt like it was worth the risk because they were taking risks either way. And the end of this chapter, he asks her what she thinks about moving into one of the more occupied areas, Saylorville, Halstead, or Coy. None of them need a doctor now, but one probably will someday soon. And she's taken really aback by this because she is like, we have our whole own community, but why would we want to like go somewhere where we don't necessarily know that they are going to trust us? And he says, this is a healthy young group of people. We have no old people except me. Not even a problem pregnancy or a child with worms. Almost any town in the area needs a doctor more than Acorn does. And that was an interesting argument where I'm not sure I believe that that is his motivation. But yeah, he asked her to just think about it. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'm going to wrap this up. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I hope that you guys enjoyed listening to the episode. If you were trying to watch it on Crowdcast, my apologies. And I will be seeing you again soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
was an Unspoiled Network podcast.